This video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Lewis, John Mezzo, Henry Kerr, Mike Ran, Cameron Strauss, Rudbot, Tom Sparty, and a special thanks to newcomer ARW for their contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Saw video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. Julia Gillard's legacy in Australian politics is definitely a decisive one. As Australia's first female Prime Minister, she became both an icon to admire as well as a figure to hate. To some, she was a great Prime Minister who was brought down by a sexist elite, while to others, she was unlikable and passed terrible policies that increased the cost of living and weakened the economy. Where do I stand? Stay tuned to find out as I put our 27th Prime Minister in the spotlight. Gillard's story begins in the town of Barry, Wales, located to the southwest of Cardiff. This made Julia Gillard the first Prime Minister not to be born in Australia since Billy Hughes in 1922. She had moved to Australia in 1966 when she was only 5, growing up in my hometown of Adelaide before later moving to Melbourne to finish her university career. As you can imagine, Gillard would quickly become an icon in women's leadership, leading the Australian Union of Students as well as becoming a co-owner in the Slater and Gordon law firm. She would later join the Labor Party in the mid-80s and in the early 90s would attempt to join federal politics. However, Gillard would be unsuccessful in both the 1993 and 1996 elections. Following this failure, she would become Chief of Staff for State Labor leader John Brumby, where she would push affirmative action to get more women into the Labor Party ranks. Gillard would finally get into federal parliament in 1998 when she won the seat of Lalor. Following the 2001 election, Gillard was elevated to the Shadow Cabinet under leader Simon Crean as Shadow Minister for Population and Immigration, and later Health. During this time, Gillard was teased as a potential future leader for the Labor Party, who was struggling to find a person who could defeat Howard. However, Gillard did not make any moves. She would eventually team up with Kevin Rudd to run for the role of Deputy Leader in 2006, and in 2007 she became the first female Deputy Prime Minister in Australian history. Under Rudd, Gillard would put her workplace relations skills to good use as Minister for Education and Employment. As one of the top-ranking members of the Labor Party, she would play a major role in the Labor government's response to the global financial crisis. However, it was also during this time that support for Rudd would decline within the party due to friction with his leadership style and failed policies. Gillard would soon be pushed as an alternative leader due to her strong approval in the party. She would find a challenge in mid-2010 and to the shock of even some of her own party backbenchers, would win the challenge to become the first female Prime Minister in the nation's history. Gillard wouldn't have much time to act as Prime Minister, as only a month after becoming Prime Minister, she would head to the polls for the 2010 election. However, Gillard's campaign was rocked by instability within the party, with multiple members still supporting former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Gillard was also facing a public unsure about the Labor Party due to their sudden leadership change. Thus, come election day, Labor was dealt a massive blow, throwing the party into its first minority government since World War II. It would be in this minority position that Gillard would have to spend the next 3 years of her government. Despite having to work with the crossbench to pass policy, Gillard would surprise the nation with the sheer amount of legislation she was able to get through. One of the most controversial of these policies was the introduction of a carbon tax to tackle the damaging effects of fossil fuels on the environment. This was passed as a concession to the Greens in order to get their support. However, the policy would hurt Gillard, with it frequently being blamed for the rise in power bills at the time. Besides the carbon tax, Gillard and her team would reform schools under the Gonski scheme in order to bring forward a nationwide curriculum standard. She would also introduce the National Disability Insurance Scheme to care for vulnerable Australians. Some other notable policies would also include plain packaged cigarette packaging to disencourage smoking, as well as transitioning Australia into the digital future with the expansion of Rudd's NBN scheme. However, Gillard would struggle with a major image problem throughout her 3 years. She would be frequently maligned both in the press and wider public. Debate to why this was the case ranges from Gillard being a woman to the introduction of bad policies. Supporters of Gillard believed that she was unfairly treated by a sexist establishment who hated her aggressive policies and were willing to swoop to extremely low levels to get her out of power. Meanwhile, her critics like to point out that she was quite popular before becoming Prime Minister and believe the accusations of sexism were in fact covering up for some pretty poor policy decisions. A great example of this split in opinions on Gillard is in her misogyny speech. While lauded by some as a great example of Gillard standing up to sexism in the workplace, people often forget the wider story surrounding the speech, in which Gillard was defending House Speaker Peter Slipper, a man who had been accused of sexual harassment. Where do I personally stand in all this? To be honest, I wasn't super involved in politics at the time Gillard was Prime Minister, so I can't really speak from the moment. But looking back on her time, I do believe that her policy agenda overall was pretty solid, and I think the attacks on the carbon and mining tax were just corporate propaganda by an energy sector not willing to deal with the challenges regular Australians faced. I do also remember Gillard not being a very likeable figure. She always seemed to be angry, and I think it made it hard for Australians to like someone who didn't seem friendly. While I understand that she was facing some pretty low attacks on her character from the likes of 2GB Radio and Sky News, I think she maybe could have done a better job in being a more positive figure, brushing aside those comments. A Labour leader I would point to in this situation is Anastasia Palaszczuk, who has also faced sexist attacks but is able to be an approachable figure and lead Labour through 3 election victories, and in Queensland of all places. At the end of the day, I am a guy, so I'll never truly understand the challenges women face in politics, but I am interested to hear what you have to say. Going over to my patrons, we have ARW, who says, as an administrator of government, Julia Gillard was much more focused and organised than Kevin Rudd and was able to pass many significant reforms, most significant of which were the NDIS, the NBN and the carbon price. Unfortunately for Gillard, her brief time in power meant most of these policies were either repealed or compromised when the Liberals replaced Labour in 2013. From the moment she became PM, Gillard had to face off against an aggressive opposition leader, a hostile media, and internal dysfunction within her own party. And in the end, these forces simply overwhelmed the government as it struggled to communicate its policy successes to the broader electorate. Gillard's political career ultimately ended on a sour note when she was overthrown in 2013 before that year's election. The 3 years in which she was our Prime Minister were some of the most unpleasant in our recent political history, and the fact that these forces against were able to prevail revealed some serious defects in Australian political culture that continue to afflict us as a nation a decade later. It is to Gillard's personal credit that she was able to rule a line under which I can only imagine was a very tough period for her, and move on to what seems to be a much more rewarding post-political career in the NGO sector. While her overall legacy as leader will continue to be debated, she will always stand out in Australian history as our first female Prime Minister, an achievement that of course will never be taken away from her. Going over to YouTube, we also have Let Me Dream Please, who says, Julia Gillard is what I call a mediocre Prime Minister. While the leadership turmoil in the hung parliament dominates the thoughts of people when she is mentioned, it's hard to forget the numerous solid policies that her government implemented, many of which were built off foundations laid by the preceding Rudd government. One of which was the NDIS, a gold standard example of what bipartisanship can do. The carbon tax, despite being highly controversial and despite the fact that Gillard herself stated that there wouldn't be one under a government that she would lead, was a fantastic policy that would have led to major emissions reductions across Australia if it hadn't been repealed under the Abbott government. She wasn't able to capture the public support due to the coalition's multiple scare campaigns, but she was able to survive for 3 years under those tough circumstances, and especially being Australia's first female Prime Minister. While not perfect and far from the likes of Hawke, Keating and Rudd, she's able to persevere throughout 3 grueling years, and I applaud her for that. And you can't forget the fact that she was a woman, the first woman to hold the position. She has definitely inspired many girls to get involved in politics. And we also have Rundle Starling, who says, Julia Gillard, in my opinion, policy-wise, the worst Prime Minister ever. However, I commend her for being Australia's first female Prime Minister. I'll come back to that later. The carbon tax that Julia implemented was the worst idea ever. The effects of this tax saw the cost of living significantly increase, high job losses in the manufacturing industry, and the tax caused no real drop in CO2 emissions. Not only this, but her words of, there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, came back to haunt her when she was pressured by the Greens to implement a carbon tax in return for confidence and supply in the Senate and House. Another policy that was dreadful was the ban on live export trade. Coming from a regional community where only 1 or 2 major sources of income is what the community relies on, banning the live export trade severely hurt the towns and regional communities that relied heavily on said industry. The reason why Julia wasn't very successful electoral-wise was the way she came to power, and there was no warning of her coming to the top. I remember vividly waking up in school one day and seeing her being PM. I was shocked and surprised, as we all know. Since then, we haven't had a Prime Minister serve a full term. It was this shock that wouldn't allow Julia to get re-elected with the 76 seats in the 2010 election, which resulted in a hung parliament, where the Greens managed to squeeze the policies as I said before. I do have a respect for standing up and inspiring young girls that it is possible to become Prime Minister, and I hope that the next female Prime Minister is treated a lot more fairly and equally by Australian society. It appears as if opinions on Gillard are a lot more mixed than they were under Rudd, and I think I captured that mixed feeling in my comments too. On one side, Gillard was an expert politician who got a massive amount of policy passed despite a minority government, but on the other side she did struggle to win over Australia's support, both due to her sudden appearance on the top job and through policies which, despite my support for them, were not popular with the wider public. With Gillard done, we now move our spotlight onto arguably the most controversial Prime Minister in the modern era. Be sure to get your Tony Abbott comments in within the next 2 weeks if you want to see them featured in my next video. Until then, I'll see you later.